The train was 20 minutes late, and in Wyoming in December, 20 minutes was enough to freeze the feeling out of your hands. Colton Hale stood at the edge of the platform at Granger Station, his breath coming out in slow white clouds, his hat pulled low against the wind that came tearing off the plains like it had a grudge. The other men waiting on the platform had shifted into clusters, shoulders hunched, stamping their boots against the boards to keep the blood moving. Colton stood apart from them. He always stood apart from them. That was just the way things had gone since Clara died. He turned his coat collar up and checked the sky, though there was nothing useful to read in it. Just a low gray ceiling pressing down on everything, the kind of sky that promised more snow before morning. His boots were cracked at the left toe, and he'd wrapped the inside with a strip of oilcloth 2 weeks ago and hadn't fixed it properly since. There was always something else needing attention first on a working ranch. His daughter Nora had wanted to come. She'd made the argument at breakfast with all the seriousness of a 6-year-old who had thought very carefully about her position. "Papa, she doesn't know us yet," Nora had said, standing on the rail of her chair so she could reach her oatmeal better. "What if she's scared?" "She won't be scared. She's a grown woman." "Grown women get scared too." Colton had looked at her for a moment. She had Clara's eyes, that particular shade of brown that went darker when she was thinking hard. "You'll stay with May," he'd said. "May's watching you until I get back." Nora had accepted this with the resigned dignity of someone enduring a great injustice. She hadn't stopped looking at him until he'd climbed up on the seat of the wagon and driven out of the yard. He thought about her now, standing on the platform. She was the reason he'd sent that letter, the reason he'd agreed to this whole arrangement. Not because he wanted a wife. The word still felt strange and almost wrong, like touching something that belonged to someone else. But because Nora needed more than he knew how to give. She needed someone in the house who could show her how to be a woman, how to braid hair and mend clothes and talk through the small, tender things that a child needed to talk through. Things Colton had no language for. So he'd written the letter. 3 drafts, the first 2 thrown in the fire. He'd kept it plain. Widower, 34, working cattle ranch outside of Granger. 1 daughter, age 6, looking for a woman of steady character willing to establish a household. He hadn't promised love. He'd been honest about that. He'd said he could offer a roof and meals and fair treatment and a chance to build something solid. That was all. The agency had replied within 2 weeks. A woman in Missouri named Evelyn Hart, 31 years old, schooled, capable. References from a church minister and a former employer. The agency letter said she came from a family that had encountered reversals of circumstance. That was the phrase they used, reversals of circumstance, which Colton had understood to mean something had gone wrong for her somewhere along the way. He hadn't asked for details. He hadn't thought it mattered. He heard the train before he saw it, the low moan of the whistle carrying across the flats, and then the light of the engine coming through the gray afternoon like a slow yellow eye. The men on the platform shuffled and straightened. Colton stayed where he was. The train came in loud and steaming and braked with a shriek that sent a pair of starlings up off the station roof. Conductors appeared on the steps of the passenger cars. People began climbing down. A traveling salesman with too much luggage and a harried expression. A family with children who immediately started running in separate directions. 2 men in suits who moved quickly toward the street. Colton watched the last passenger car. She came out after nearly everyone else. She was the reason for the pause. He understood that later, not right away. He saw her feet first, coming carefully down the iron steps, one hand on the rail, the other carrying a bag. Then the rest of her came into the light of the platform, and Colton's chest went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with cold. She was thin. Not the kind of thin that came from not eating enough at 1 or 2 meals, but the kind that had gone on a long time, that had settled into her frame and become part of how she stood. Her coat was dark wool, and it would have been a fine coat once, but that time had passed. It was clean but frayed at the cuffs and missing the second button from the top, and someone had replaced it with a different button that didn't match. Beneath the coat, she wore a dress that was patched at the left shoulder, the patch done in a slightly different fabric that caught the light differently. Her boots were worn down at the heels. She carried 1 bag, just the one. She stopped at the bottom of the steps and looked at the platform, and Colton watched her face. She had dark eyes and a composed face, the kind of face that had learned not to show much on the outside because too much had happened on the inside. She was not beautiful in the way women in magazines were beautiful, but she had something. a quality he didn't have a name for yet. She looked like someone who had survived a winter and knew it wasn't the last one she'd have to survive. She spotted him because he was the only man still standing alone, and she walked toward him. Her walk was steady. That was the first thing he noticed. She didn't shuffle or hesitate. She just walked, straight and measured, like she was determined not to let anything in her posture give her away. She stopped 3 feet from him and said, "Mr. Hale?" "Yes." He took off his hat, an old habit. "I'm Evelyn Hart." A pause. "I expect you already knew that." "I did." He put his hat back on. There was a beat of silence that went a little too long, and he was aware of it and couldn't seem to do anything about it. His eyes went, against his will, to the single bag in her hand. He pulled them back up to her face. "Was the journey all right?" "Long," she said, "but I've had worse." He reached for the bag. "I'll take that." She handed it over without argument, and he felt the weight of it. Not heavy. Light, actually. He'd carried heavier things in one hand without noticing. He tried not to let that register on his face, and wasn't entirely sure he'd succeeded. "Wagon's out front," he said. "All right." They walked off the platform together. Not side by side exactly. There was a few inches of distance between them, the kind of distance that two strangers maintain when they haven't figured out yet how close they're supposed to be. The drive back to the ranch took 40 minutes in good weather. Tonight the road was hard-packed ice under a dusting of new snow, and Colton kept the horse to a careful pace. They sat on the wagon seat with the wind cutting across the open country, and Colton had put a blanket across the seat for her to use, and she'd taken it without comment and pulled it up over her knees. For the first 10 minutes, neither of them said anything. The horse's breath steamed, the wheels crunched. Far off to the north, the sky had taken on a pale, bruised color that meant more snow coming. "How long have you been out here?" Evelyn asked. She was looking at the country. Her eyes moved across it like she was taking inventory. 8 years, Colton said. "Came out from Ohio, bought the land from a man who'd given up on it." "Why had he given up?" Colton glanced at her. "Hard winters, dry summers, cattle prices dropping, the usual." "But you didn't give up." "Not yet," he said. It came out flatter than he intended. "The place needs work. I want to be straight with you about that. It's a working ranch, It's not comfortable in the way you might be used to." A short silence. "Mr. Hale," she said, "I don't think you need to worry about what I'm used to." He looked at her again. She was still watching the country, her expression even. "There's a bedroom set up," he said. "For you, private. I want to be clear about that. The arrangement—" He stopped, tried again. "Nothing is expected of you beyond what we agreed, which was to help with the household and with my daughter. Everything else is—" He waved a hand vaguely, which wasn't helpful. "There's no pressure." "I understood the letter," she said quietly. "Right." He faced forward again. "Good." Another long silence. The wind picked up, carrying a sting of ice crystals, and Evelyn pulled the blanket slightly higher. "What's her name?" she asked. "Your daughter." "Nora." "How old?" 6, 7 in March. "What is she like?" The question surprised him a little. Not that it was unusual, but that it was the first question she'd asked that wasn't about the practical arrangement of things. "Horses," he said. "She'd spend every hour in the barn if I let her. And stories. She likes to be read to, but she's picking up reading herself now, quicker than I expected." He paused. She can be a lot to manage. She asks questions constantly, about everything." "That's a good quality," Evelyn said. "It's exhausting," he said, and then felt something almost like a smile pull at one corner of his mouth. "But yeah, it's a good quality." Evelyn didn't say anything to that, but something shifted slightly in her expression. Not a smile exactly, more like the shadow of one. The house was lit when they came up the track. May Brody, the widow who lived 2 miles east and who had been helping Colton with Nora since Clara died, had the kitchen lamp going and the smoke coming thick and steady from the chimney. Colton pulled up in front and helped Evelyn down from the wagon. She took his hand briefly and let go of it as soon as her feet were on the ground, efficiently, without making anything of it. He didn't have time to knock or announce anything. The door came open before they reached it. Nora stood in the doorway in her nightdress and wool socks, her dark hair coming half out of its braid, a candle in one hand that May was already reaching around to take away from her before she set something on fire. She looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked at her. "Nora," Colton said, "I told May to put you to bed." "May told me to go to bed," Nora corrected, with the particular accuracy of a child who understood the difference. "I decided to wait." Her eyes hadn't left Evelyn. "Are you the lady?" "I am," Evelyn said. "I'm Evelyn. I'm Nora Elizabeth Hale." She said it the way she'd practiced it, Colton could tell, formal and complete. "We have hot cider. May made it because I said you'd be cold." "I am cold," Evelyn said. "That was very thoughtful." Nora looked pleased with herself in the barely concealed way that children do when they've done something they were proud of. She stepped back from the door. "You can come in." Colton watched Evelyn step into the house. He watched his daughter move immediately to stand beside her, not touching, but close. That gravitational nearness that Nora had always had with people she decided she liked. She'd had it with Clara. She'd had it with May. He hadn't seen it with anyone else in 2 years. May Brody appeared from the kitchen doorway, wiping her hands on her apron, and gave Colton a look over Evelyn's head that he couldn't entirely read. May had opinions about everything and kept most of them to herself, which Colton had always respected even when it made him uneasy. "Miss Hart," May said. "Long trip?" "Long enough," Evelyn said. "The cider smells wonderful." "Sit down. Get warm." But later, after May had gone home and Nora had been persuaded into bed, a process that took 3 rounds of negotiation and 1 story read out loud by Evelyn, who had simply picked up the book from the shelf without being asked and started reading in a clear, steady voice while Nora burrowed under her quilt. Colton sat at the kitchen table with his cup and tried to account for what he was feeling. It wasn't what he'd expected. He'd expected to feel relieved, maybe, practical, like a problem had been moved 1 step toward being solved. Instead, he felt something closer to unsettled. Not badly, just unsettled. He heard her come back into the kitchen, and she went to the stove without speaking and poured herself more cider and stood there with the cup in both hands, warming her fingers. She had taken off her coat. The dress she wore beneath it was clean and pressed, but it was old. He could see where the fabric had been carefully mended at the wrist and once along the side seam. He hadn't expected this. He'd read the agency letter 3 times and not once had the word poor come into it. Reversals of circumstance. That was the phrase. He'd imagined a woman who'd had some hard years, maybe lost a husband, maybe had a bad business season. He hadn't imagined this. He turned his cup in his hands. "Can I ask you something?" he said. She turned to look at him, waiting. "The agency said that things had been difficult for your family." He stopped. He wasn't sure how to ask it without making it worse. "I just want to understand what I—" He tried again. "Is there anything you need that you haven't got? Anything you came without that we should take care of tomorrow?" She looked at him for a moment. "I have what I need," she said. "You have 1 bag." "I know how many bags I have." It wasn't sharp exactly, but it was firm. He nodded and let it go. She sat down across from him at the table, not close. The table was wide enough that they were still a fair distance apart. She wrapped both hands around her cup. "I want to do this properly," she said after a moment. "I know how it looks. I know you looked at me at the station and thought—" She paused, and something moved in her face, briefly. "I know what you thought, but I'm not here to take anything from you. I'm here because Nora needs someone. That's what your letter said, and that's the only reason I answered it." "You don't have to justify yourself," he said. "I know I don't." She looked at him steadily. "I'm choosing to." He held her gaze for a moment, then he nodded again. "All right," he said. "Fair enough." Outside, the wind pressed against the windows, and the snow was coming down steadily now, the kind that committed itself and didn't stop before morning. Inside, the kitchen was warm with the smell of cider and wood smoke, and somewhere in the back of the house, Nora was asleep with her quilt pulled up and the lamp turned down. He didn't sleep well. He never did, but that night was worse than usual. He lay on his side in the dark and stared at the wall and thought about Clara. He thought about the morning she died. It had been a Tuesday in early October 2 years ago, and the sky had been that pure blue that Wyoming got in fall. the kind of sky that felt almost unkind in its beauty given what was happening below it. Clara had been sick for months, a lung sickness that had started as a cough and had not stopped being a cough until it became something much worse. The doctor from Granger had come out twice, and the second time had taken Colton aside and told him plainly what the next months would look like. And Colton had stood in the yard afterward for a long time without moving. She'd died with him beside her and Nora asleep in the next room, which was both the right way and the hardest way. He'd sat with her until dawn, and then he'd gotten up and made breakfast for Nora, and not said anything about it until Nora had asked where Mama was. He didn't know how people survived that. He still didn't know. He just knew that apparently some of them did. He'd agreed to the mail order arrangement 4 months ago. It had taken a year and a half to even consider it, and another 2 months to actually write the letter. He told himself it was for Nora. And it was for Nora. That was true. But lying in the dark that night, listening to the wind and the creak of the house settling under snow, he admitted to himself that it was also because the silence in the house had become something he couldn't keep carrying alone. Not that Evelyn Hart was a cure for silence. He barely knew her. But the house sounded different tonight, that was all. Just different. Christmas morning came in white and bitter. Colton was up before dawn, as always, and had the stove going and coffee on by the time the light started to press through the windows. He pulled on his coat and boots and went out to see to the animals. The ranch was small by Wyoming standards. A main house, a barn with 6 stalls, a smokehouse, a chicken coop that needed new boards on the south wall, and a split-rail corral that Colton had been adding to gradually for 3 years. He had 11 head of cattle, 2 horses, the chickens, and a dog named Soot, who was mostly useless as a working dog, but who Nora loved with a devotion that Colton understood. He fed and watered and forked hay and checked the cattle, and by the time he came back to the house, there were 2 sets of footprints in the fresh snow on the porch, 1 small pair and 1 larger, leading around to the side of the house and back. He stood at the porch steps and followed them with his eyes and didn't know what to make of it. He came inside to find Nora sitting at the kitchen table with her hair braided, properly braided, with 2 even plaits and a ribbon on each end, not the lopsided construction that was the best Colton could manage. And Evelyn at the stove with his apron on over her dress, her back to the door, stirring something. The kitchen smelled like cornmeal and something sweet, maple, maybe, and the smell hit him in the chest in a way that surprised him. Claire had made cornbread on winter mornings. He hadn't smelled it since. "Papa?" Nora looked up from the book she was pretending to read while watching Evelyn. "Did you know Evelyn knows how to set a snare? She showed me this morning. We went around the side of the house." "It was just a simple loop," Evelyn said, without turning around. "For rabbits. I didn't think you'd mind." "I don't," Colton said. He was still standing in the doorway. He made himself come fully inside and take his coat off. "You were up early." "I'm always up early." She said it like it was a fact about weather. "Nora came and found me. I hope that's all right." He looked at Nora, who had the expression of someone who had done an innocent and completely spontaneous thing. "I couldn't sleep," Nora said. "You never can." "I don't think sleeping is as important as people say." Evelyn laughed. It was short and surprised-sounding, like she hadn't expected to, and she turned a little toward the room when she did it, not facing them fully but enough that he caught the edge of it. It changed her face completely when she laughed. He hadn't seen that coming. "Sit down," she said, turning back to the stove. Her voice was ordinary again. "Breakfast is almost ready." He sat down across from Nora, and Nora immediately leaned forward with her elbows on the table and her chin in her hands, watching him with her mother's eyes. "She read me 2 chapters last night," Nora said, "after you thought I was asleep. You were supposed to be asleep. I was listening with my eyes closed. That's different." Colton put his hand over his eyes briefly. "Papa," Nora said, her voice dropping to the tone she used when she was going to ask something important, "are you going to be mean to her?" The question landed like a stone in still water. "Nora, because May says sometimes people are mean to people who've had hard times, and I don't want you to be mean to her." She was watching him very seriously. "She's nice. She knows how to set a snare, and she reads really well, and she didn't sigh when I asked her a lot of questions last night. Most people sigh." He kept his face even with some effort. "I'm not going to be mean to her. Promise." "Nora? Papa?" He met her eyes, Clara's eyes. "I promise." he said quietly. Nora sat back, satisfied. She picked up her book again. Evelyn set a plate in front of him, cornbread and fried eggs, and a small dish of preserves that he recognized as a jar he'd put up last summer and forgotten about entirely. She set a plate in front of Nora and then took a seat herself at the far end of the table with her own plate. And for the first time in 2 years, there were 3 plates on the table at breakfast. He ate without saying much. Nora talked enough for everyone. Evelyn answered her questions with patience that didn't sound like effort, which was unusual. Most people's patience with Nora had a sound to it, a slight tightening, a barely there edge, the patience of someone waiting for the child to stop. Evelyn's didn't have that edge. She just answered. After they'd eaten and Nora had been sent to get properly dressed, Colton stayed at the table with his coffee. Evelyn cleared the plates without being asked. "You don't have to do that," he said. "It needs doing. You just got here." She set the plates by the basin and looked at him over her shoulder. "Mr. Hale, I know what the arrangement is. I'm not going to sit and wait to be told what to do. I'm going to do what needs doing. You can tell me if I do something wrong." He didn't have an answer for that. He nodded. She turned back to the basin. "Evelyn." He said it before he'd quite decided to. She turned again, waiting. "It's Christmas," he said. And then, because he hadn't meant for that to come out sounding like a complaint or a non sequitur, he added, "I just mean, you don't have to spend it working." She looked at him for a moment. Something moved in her expression that he couldn't read. Not quite sadness, not quite wry, something between them. "I don't know what else to do with it," she said honestly. He held her gaze for a second. Then he picked up his cup. "That makes 2 of us," he said. She turned back to the basin, and the sound of water and the crackle of the fire were the only sounds in the kitchen. And outside, the snow kept falling on the Wyoming frontier, covering everything evenly and without distinction, the way snow always did. By midday, the storm had let up enough to let some thin winter sun through, and Nora had talked Evelyn into looking at the horses. Colton was in the barn working on a hinge when they came in, Nora's hand in Evelyn's in a way that was so natural-looking it stopped him cold for a moment before he remembered to keep working. "That's Clover," Nora announced, pointing to the brown mare. "She's the nice one. The gray one is Murphy, and he's grumpy, but Papa says he's not mean, he's just particular." "Particular," Evelyn repeated, looking at Murphy with what seemed like genuine appraisal. She put her hand out, knuckles first, and let the horse smell it before she touched his nose. Murphy tossed his head once and then settled, which he did for very few people. Nora noticed. "He likes you," she said, delighted. "He's deciding," Evelyn said. "There's a difference." Colton watched from the shadows near the workbench. She stood straight in the horse's presence, not tense, not trying to impress anyone, just calm, like she'd been around horses before. Like a lot of things hadn't scared her, or if they had, she'd learned to stand straight anyway. He went back to the hinge. He didn't examine what he was feeling. He was not in the habit of examining what he was feeling, but something had shifted in the last 16 hours, something small and not entirely comfortable, like a stone turned over to show what was underneath. He couldn't have named it, and he wasn't going to try. He just worked the hinge back into place and listened to his daughter laughing in the background, that full-bodied sound that Nora had, the laugh that sounded like she meant it all the way down. He hadn't heard that laugh in a while. He'd forgotten, a little, how loud it was. He tightened the screw and didn't let himself think about it anymore. That night, after Nora was finally and genuinely asleep, Evelyn had read to her again, another 2 chapters. Colton could hear the low, even sound of her voice through the door. Colton sat on the porch despite the cold. He could see the stars now that the storm had passed, sharp and close the way they got in deep winter on the plains. The kind of sky that made you feel small in a way that was almost comforting. He didn't stay long. His feet were cold and his hands were going numb, and there was nothing useful about sitting outside freezing on Christmas night. But before he went in, he looked out across the white ranch yard. The snow covering the corral rails, the barn roof smoothed clean, the thin line of the track running out toward the road and disappearing into the dark. And something in his chest shifted. Not big, just small. Like a door that had been frozen shut, not opened, not even moved, just tested. Just the faintest press of something against the inside of it. He went in out of the cold, and the house was warm, and somewhere inside his daughter was sleeping with her hair braided properly for the first time in longer than he could remember. He didn't let himself name what that meant. He just turned the lamp down and went to bed. The first week passed, the way first weeks on a working ranch always did, in the relentless grind of things that needed doing before the cold made them impossible. Colton spent most of his daylight hours outside, patching the south wall of the chicken coop, breaking ice off the water trough twice a day, hauling wood from the pile behind the barn, and stacking it close to the house where it would be easier to reach in a bad storm. He worked the way he always worked, which was steadily and without much conversation, and he told himself that everything at the house was running the same as it always had. But it wasn't, and he knew it wasn't, even if he didn't say so. He noticed things in the way a man notices things he isn't looking for. The window in the front room had been stuck for 2 months. The frame had warped over the summer, and he'd meant to plane it down and hadn't gotten to it. And on the third morning after Evelyn arrived, he walked past and saw that it closed properly, flush with the sill. He stood there for a moment and then walked on. He didn't ask about it. Later, he found a short-handled plane on the workbench in the barn that hadn't been there before, set neatly beside his tools like it belonged there. The curtains in the kitchen got mended. There was a small split in the fabric at the hem of the left panel that had been letting cold air through all fall, and Colton had noticed it the way he noticed all the small things he hadn't fixed, with a low, tired awareness that another thing needed doing. One morning, it was fixed. The stitching was small and even and barely visible. He stood looking at it with his coffee cup in his hand and felt something he couldn't quite account for. He went outside and split wood for an hour. Nora, for her part, had taken to following Evelyn like a second shadow. Not in the clinging, anxious way she sometimes followed Colton, the way that said she was afraid he'd disappear too, but in the easy, curious way of a child who has found something genuinely interesting and wants to be close to it. She sat at the kitchen table while Evelyn cooked and asked questions. She stood on a stool beside her while Evelyn showed her how to check if bread dough had risen enough. She dragged her outside to see where Soot had dug a hole under the fence and stood beside her in the snow, both of them looking at the hole, having what appeared to be a serious discussion about why dogs dug holes and what should be done about it. Colton watched this from a distance. He didn't know what to do with it, so he watched it the way he watched the weather, carefully, from a position of cautious non-involvement. On the 5th day, he came in from the barn at midday and found Evelyn at the table with Nora's reader open between them. Nora was sounding out words with her finger moving under each one, and Evelyn was listening without interrupting, wading through the hard ones, not filling in the word before Nora got there herself. When Nora got a word right that she'd been struggling with, Evelyn just moved her finger to the next word. No excessive praise, no big reaction, just kept going. Colton hung up his coat and hat and stood in the doorway. Nora hadn't seen him yet. Nora's finger moved. Prepare. That's right, Evelyn said. Keep going. Colton backed out of the doorway quietly and went to wash up at the pump. That evening at supper, he said, "She's reading better." Evelyn looked up from her plate. "She's been reading well. She just needs someone to sit with her while she does it. She doesn't like to read alone." "She never said." "She probably didn't know how to say it." Evelyn cut a piece of potato. "She's 6. He ate in silence for a moment. "Her teacher in town, she only goes twice a week. The roads are too bad in winter for more. Her teacher said she was behind." "She's not behind," Evelyn said. Not sharply, but with a certainty that made him look at her. "She reads fine. She just needs more practice than some children and less interruption than others. That's not the same as being behind." Colton turned that over. "You've taught before?" A pause, just a half beat too long. "Some," she said. He didn't push it. He had the feeling already that there were things Evelyn would say when she was ready to say them, and that pressing her before then wouldn't get him anywhere. It was May who told him, not intentionally. May wasn't the kind of woman who spread what she knew carelessly. But they were standing in May's yard on a Tuesday afternoon when Colton had driven over to return a borrowed harness collar, and May said something that opened a door he hadn't known was there. "She wrote me," May said, surprising him. "She was talking about Evelyn. Before she came, the agency gave her my name as a local contact. She wanted to know about Nora, what she liked, what she was afraid of, what kind of stories she liked to be read." May looked at Colton steadily. "She did that before she even knew if you'd kept the agreement. Colton stood with the harness collar in his hands. She wrote you. 2 letters. Asked me not to tell you until she'd been there a while. May took the collar from him. I'm telling you now because I think you're misreading the situation. I'm not misreading anything. You're being careful, May said, which was her particular way of not agreeing with him, which is your right. But that woman came here without a scrap of pride left to protect, and she's still standing straight. That tells you something. He drove home thinking about that, about Evelyn sitting somewhere in Missouri, writing letters to a stranger about his daughter's favorite stories before she even knew for certain she'd be coming. He found himself, that evening, asking the question he'd been not asking since she arrived. Nora was in bed. The house was quiet. Evelyn was at the table with a piece of mending in her hands. She'd found a basket of it in the back room, things Colton had set aside over months with the intention of dealing with them, and had started working through it without comment. He sat across from her with his coffee, and for a few minutes neither of them spoke. Then he said, "The agency letter said you'd had reversals of circumstance." She didn't look up from the mending. "That's what they called it. What would you call it?" She pulled the thread through once, twice. Then she set the mending down and looked at him, her hands flat on the table. "My father had a dry goods business in Hannibal," she said. "We weren't wealthy, but we were stable. I worked in the store from the time I was old enough to count change. I did the books when I was 16 because my father's eyes were getting bad." She paused. He had a business partner, a man named Greer. They'd been partners for 11 years. Colton waited. "Greer had been skimming from the accounts for the last 3 of those 11 years, she said. Her voice was flat and even. "When my father found out, Greer threatened to claim the whole business was my father's fraud. He had enough. He'd arranged enough that he could make it look that way if he wanted to." She picked the mending back up, not really looking at it. "My father was 61 years old. He wasn't a dishonest man. He'd never been a dishonest man in his life." She paused. "Greer offered to walk away clean if we walked away from the business, signed it over. And your father signed." "I made him sign," she said. Her voice didn't change, but something in her jaw did. "I was the one who said it was better, that we'd find another way, that protecting his name was worth more than the building." She was quiet for a moment. "I was wrong about the finding another way part. My father died 8 months later. My mother was already gone by then. And the money we'd saved, the little we had left, went to the doctor bills and the burying." The fire cracked in the stove. Colton sat with his hands around his cup. "I'm sorry," he said. It came out quieter than he intended. She shook her head slightly, not dismissing the sympathy, more like setting it aside somewhere out of the way. "I taught school for 2 years after that, in a small town east of Hannibal. The schoolhouse closed when the town's main mill closed and half the families left." She pulled the thread through. "I did housekeeping for a while, took in mending, did what there was to do." She looked at him. "I'm not telling you this so you feel sorry for me. I'm telling you because you asked, and because I think you should know who you've agreed to this arrangement with." "I didn't ask because I feel sorry for you." "I know," she said. "That's why I answered." There was a long pause. The kind that wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but had weight to it. "Greer still has the business?" Colton asked. "As far as I know." A beat. "He changed the name." Colton set down his cup. He had a feeling about men like Greer, a specific grinding feeling in the back of his teeth that had always been his body's way of telling him something was wrong with the world. "That's not right," he said. It was an insufficient thing to say. He knew it was insufficient. "No," Evelyn agreed simply. "It's not." She went back to the mending, and after a while Colton went to bed, and he lay in the dark thinking about a 61-year-old man signing away his life's work to protect his name, and a woman standing in a train station in borrowed coat buttons, still standing straight. January came in hard. The temperature dropped to the kind of cold that killed anything careless. Livestock left without shelter, pipes not properly wrapped, a man who spent too long outside without checking his face for the white patches that meant frostbite. Colton knew how to manage cold. He'd been managing Wyoming cold for 8 years. But that January was meaner than usual, and it kept him close to the ranch, working through a list of repairs and preparations that never quite got shorter. Evelyn learned the rhythm of the place quickly. She didn't have to be told what needed doing twice, and she didn't wait to be told at all if she could see it herself. She was methodical, the kind of methodical that came from running a household on very little for a long time, the kind that didn't waste anything, not wood or water or flour or an hour of daylight. She kept the fire at a level that was warm enough without burning through the wood too fast. She made stock from bones and vegetable ends and turned it into soup when the week's other cooking had been heavy, which stretched the food without anyone noticing it was being stretched. Colton noticed. He didn't say anything. He noticed. Nora was thriving in a way that Colton watched with a feeling he couldn't name and was reluctant to examine too closely. She was brighter, more animated, more talkative than usual, which was saying something because Nora had never had a deficit of conversation. But there was a lightness to her now that hadn't been there in a long time. She laughed more. She slept better. She stopped waking up in the middle of the night and coming to stand at Colton's door, which she'd done on and off since Clara died, just standing there until he heard her and got up and brought her back to bed. He didn't connect these things to Evelyn right away, or rather he connected them, but he told himself the connection was obvious and coincidental. The child had been lonely. Now there was someone in the house. Naturally, she was happier. It didn't need to mean anything beyond that. One afternoon in the middle of January, he came in from the barn and found Nora sitting on the kitchen floor with her legs crossed and Evelyn sitting across from her in the same position, both of them with their hands flat on their knees, both of them very still and very serious. A game of some kind. He stopped in the doorway. "You blinked," Nora said. "I did not." "Your left eye. It twitched." "A twitch isn't a blink." Nora appeared to consider this point on its merits. "I think it should count," she said. "That wasn't in the rules. The rules should have said that." "The rules say what they say." Evelyn's face was straight, but barely. "You need to look at my nose, not my eyes. Looking at someone's eyes makes you blink more." "That's cheating. That's technique." Colton set down the armload of wood he was carrying. Both of them looked up at him. "Don't move," Nora said immediately, with great authority. "We're in the middle of something." "Don't let me stop you," Colton said. He started stacking the wood by the stove. He heard Nora's sharp intake of breath behind him and knew without looking that she'd blinked. The game was over. "You distracted me," Nora accused, but she didn't sound particularly aggrieved. She was already scrambling up off the floor. "Papa, Evelyn knows 17 games you can play without anything, just with your hands and your brain." "Is that right?" "She's going to teach me all of them." Nora grabbed Evelyn's sleeve and tugged. "What's the next one?" "After supper," Evelyn said. Promise?" "I promise." Nora let go of her sleeve and went to peer into the pot on the stove, which she did every evening, and which told her nothing useful, and Colton glanced across the kitchen at Evelyn. She was getting to her feet, brushing off her skirt, and for a second she caught his eye. He looked away first. He wasn't sure why. It was Dora Sims who said it first. That was always the way in Granger. Someone said it first, and then everyone else felt permitted to say it too. Colton had gone into town on a Thursday to pick up a part he'd ordered from the hardware store and to pick up supplies at Henley's general store. He'd been in Henley's for 10 minutes when he became aware that he was being talked about. Not directly. He was standing at the counter, his back to the room. But the conversation at the table near the window, where Dora Sims and her friend Peg Atwood sat with their weekly coffee, had shifted in a way he recognized. The careful, slightly too normal tone of women saying something they'd say differently if the subject weren't in earshot. "Not saying it's wrong, I'm just saying it's peculiar, is all," Dora was saying. "You look at the woman and you have to wonder, an agency bride with no more than a coat on her back? A respectable woman by that age, in that condition? There's something that doesn't—" "Dora." Peg, who had more restraint, said it quietly. "I'm just saying what people are thinking." A pause. "She came off that train in December looking like she'd crawled out of a ditch," is what Ruth Calloway told me. Ruth was at the station, and Colton Hale is a good man, whatever his faults, and it seems to me a good man deserves to know what he's brought into his house. Colton turned around. He didn't plan to. His body did it before his mind had caught up. Dora Sims looked at him with the particular expression of a woman who had said something she was only slightly sorry he'd heard. "Dora," he said. His voice was level. He'd learned a long time ago that the most effective tone was level. You need something from the counter, or are you just visiting? A silence. Just visiting, Dora said. All right, he said. He turned back to the counter. He didn't say anything else. He picked up his supplies and paid and drove home, and the whole way home he told himself it didn't matter. It was Dora Sims. It was small-town talk, which he'd been ignoring his entire adult life. It had nothing to do with Evelyn or with his household or with anything that was actually real. But it got in. The way things did when you were already a little uncertain, not the words themselves. He didn't care about Dora Sims' words, but the question underneath them, the question he'd been carrying since the platform at Granger Station in December. What am I doing here, and do I know enough about this woman to be sure? He didn't mention the conversation to Evelyn. He didn't mention it to anyone. But something in him went a little quieter over the next few days, a little more careful. He found himself watching her in a different way. Not warmly, not coldly, just with that careful evaluating attention of a man who has been reminded to be cautious. He hated himself for it a little. He did it anyway. Well, Evelyn noticed. Of course she noticed. She had the specific observational precision of someone who had spent years reading rooms, reading people, learning to sense a shift in temperature before it became weather. The slight withdrawal in Colton's manner was as clear to her as a change in wind direction. She didn't say anything. She kept doing what she was doing, the cooking, the cleaning, the mending, the reading with Nora, the slow, careful work of keeping a household running through a Wyoming winter. She helped Colton patch the gap in the barn door that had been letting cold air in through the left hinge without being asked, and without making anything of it. She kept her face even. She kept her voice steady. But at night, in her room, with the lamp turned low, she lay awake and looked at the ceiling and felt the particular specific weight of being doubted. She knew that weight well. She'd been carrying it in one form or another for a long time. Since Greer, since the store, since the small-town schoolhouse, where parents had looked at her sideways because she was an unmarried woman of 30 with no family to vouch for her. She'd learned to carry it without letting it show. That didn't mean it didn't hurt. She just kept the hurt somewhere out of the way. She thought about leaving, not seriously, not as a plan, but the thought came the way it always came in quiet, dark moments, as a question about what else there was, where else she would go. The answer, each time, was the same. Nowhere that was better. She had no family left. She had no savings. She had what she'd built here, in 3 weeks, which was small and fragile and possibly already undermined. But it was something. And there was Nora. That was the thing that pinned her in place when the ceiling pressed down and the cold crept through the walls. Not the practical calculus of having nowhere better to go, but Nora's voice through the wall at bedtime, calling out Evelyn, "Can you come read?" In a tone that assumed she would, that took her presence for granted in the uncalculating way children took for granted the things they trusted. Nora, who had her mother's eyes and her father's stubborn set to her chin, who asked 17 questions about everything and then asked 3 more, who held Evelyn's hand without ceremony when they walked outside because she needed a hand to hold, and Evelyn's was there. Evelyn hadn't had someone hold her hand in a long time. She turned onto her side and pulled the quilt up and closed her eyes. She wasn't going anywhere. The thing that shifted it, the first thing, the small thing that came before the larger one, happened on a Saturday afternoon in late January. The temperature had dropped hard overnight, and by morning it was clear that the water pipe that ran from the pump to the kitchen basin had partially frozen. Colton had dealt with it before. It was a regular winter problem, but that day he was out fixing a section of fence that had come down in the previous night's wind and couldn't leave it. He'd mentioned the pipe before going out, told Evelyn where the spare length of pipe lagging was, and said he'd deal with it when he came back in. And Evelyn had said all right. When he came back in 3 hours later, the pipe was working. He stood at the kitchen basin and ran the water and looked at it. He found her in the side room off the kitchen that they used for storage, putting tools back in order. Her hands were red from the cold. She'd had to work in the crawlspace under the far side of the kitchen floor where the pipe ran, and the temperature down there, even with insulation, was close to brutal. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know." She set the last tool on the shelf. "It's a bad crawlspace. Cold, tight space." He looked at her hands. "Did you wrap up?" "I'm fine." She flexed her fingers, which were stiff. It wasn't complicated. The lagging had slipped off a section. I just rewrapped it and let the pipe warm up slowly. How do you know how to do that? She looked at him. My father ran a store for 30 years. When something broke, we fixed it. I learned how things worked because there wasn't always money to pay someone to fix them. She said it without defensiveness, just plainly. I know how to do a lot of things because of that. He stood there for a moment, then he said, "Let me see your hands." She looked surprised, but she held them out, and it reddened, a little raw at the knuckles. He went to the kitchen and came back with a cloth he'd warmed at the stove. Not hot, just warm, and handed it to her without comment. She took it and wrapped it around her fingers, and they stood there in the small, crowded storage room with its shelves of spare parts and old tools, and the smell of oil and cold air, not saying anything. "Thank you," she said finally, quietly. "You fixed my pipe." "Yes." "I should be thanking you." "You can thank me and I can thank you," she said. "It's not a competition." He looked at her. Something in her face was different right now. Not the composed evenness she wore most of the time, but something slightly less armored. She was tired. Not sleep-tired, the other kind. "Evelyn," he said. She looked at him. "I heard some things in town," he said. He decided in the past 30 seconds that not saying it was worse than saying it. Dora Sims, she had opinions about you, about the situation. Evelyn's face went very still. "I want you to know," he said carefully, "that I don't put a lot of stock in what Dora Sims says, but I want to be honest with you. I've been not distant exactly, but cautious, and it wasn't fair." He looked at the floor briefly, then back at her. "You've been doing everything you said you'd do. You've done more than what you said. And I've been standing back like I was waiting for something to go wrong." He stopped. "I don't know exactly what I'm trying to say." "You're trying to say you're sorry," Evelyn said. Her voice was careful and level. Without quite saying it, he exhaled. "Yeah, it's all right." She folded the cloth. "I've been waiting for it, for you to pull back. Everyone does, eventually, when they hear things." "I shouldn't have." "No," she agreed. "But it's not the worst thing anyone's done." He looked at her for a long moment. "It won't happen again," he said. She held his gaze. He meant it. He could tell she was reading whether he meant it, and he did. "All right," she said finally. He nodded once. "All right." He went back to the kitchen and put more wood on the fire. She came in a few minutes later and started on supper, and neither of them said anything more about it, and Nora came in from wherever she'd been with Soot and announced that the dog had found something under the porch that was either a rabbit or a very large mouse, and the evening moved forward on its ordinary axis. But something had shifted in the house. Something small. Something that wasn't fixed, not yet, and maybe couldn't be fixed in a single conversation. But the direction was different now. The lean was different. Outside, January pressed on with its cold, indifferent business. The fire burned. The snow came again before morning, soft and steady, covering the yard in a clean white that looked, for a few hours at least, like something that hadn't been through anything. Inside, 3 people were learning the careful, slow work of making a household out of the pieces of separate lives, which was harder than any of them had expected and was going, despite everything, despite the cold and the doubt and the weight of all the things not yet said, in a direction that felt, if not safe exactly, then at least possible. That was enough. For now, that was enough. The peace that had settled over the Hale Ranch after Colton's apology in the storage room was real. But it was the kind of peace that had been recently built and hadn't yet been tested. Colton knew that. He thought Evelyn knew it too. They didn't talk about it. That wasn't how either of them operated. But there was a different quality to the household in the first weeks of February. Something slightly warmer and slightly less braced, like a body unclenching after holding itself tense for too long. Nora noticed without knowing she noticed. She was happier at the table. She talked more freely. She had started a habit of bringing things to show Evelyn. A smooth stone she'd found at the edge of the barn, a drawing she'd made of soot that looked more like a cloud with legs, a question about why snow was white when water wasn't. And Evelyn received each of these offerings with the same calm, unhurried attention. She never made Nora feel small for what she brought. She never pretended to be more interested than she was either. She was just honest about it, which Nora responded to more than she would have responded to manufactured enthusiasm. Colton watched this and felt grateful, and kept the gratitude mostly to himself, which was his way. But February in Wyoming was not a month that let things stay quiet. The storms came in harder than January's had, 3 of them in 2 weeks, and by the middle of the month, the snow was piled to the windowsill on the north side of the house, and the track out to the road had drifted over twice. They were snowbound for 4 days after the second storm, the 3 of them in Soot and the livestock. And Colton had the particular experience of learning what a person was actually made of when they couldn't go anywhere, and there was nothing to do but be present. What Evelyn was made of, it turned out, was steadiness. She didn't fill the silence with noise. She didn't manufacture cheerfulness when she didn't feel it. She played games with Nora and taught her a new card game and read to her in the afternoon, and then sat at the table in the evenings with her mending or the book she'd borrowed from the small shelf in the front room. Just quiet, just present. There was nothing performance about it. She wasn't trying to demonstrate anything. What Colton was made of, in the enforced company of 4 days of being snowed in, was a man more comfortable with silence than conversation, but not entirely comfortable with either, which Evelyn seemed to have worked out quickly and which she left alone. She didn't push at him. She didn't try to draw him out. If he sat at the table with his coffee and didn't say anything for an hour, she sat at the other end of the table and didn't say anything either. And somehow, this was better than being talked at would have been. On the 3rd evening of the snowbound stretch, after Nora was in bed and the wind was doing its worst against the north wall of the house, Colton said, without entirely planning to, "Clara used to hate the storms. She didn't like being inside. She'd get—" He stopped, started again. She'd get restless. Walk the same path from the kitchen to the front room and back. Drive herself half crazy. Evelyn looked up from her book. She didn't say anything, which was the right thing. She was from Tennessee originally. She grew up where winters were nothing like this. Never quite got used to it. He turned his coffee cup. "I used to think it would get better, that she'd adjust. She never did, really." A pause. The fire. The wind outside. "What was she like?" Evelyn asked. Quietly. Not prying. The way a person asked a question they thought might be unwanted, but that felt important enough to risk. Colton sat with that for a moment. "Stubborn," he said. "Funnier than she let most people see. She had an opinion about everything, and she was right about most of them, and she knew it." Something moved across his face. She was a good mother. Better than she thought she was. She worried about Nora too much. Used to sit up at night just to listen to her breathe. "Nora knows she was loved," Evelyn said. "Yeah." His voice had gone slightly rough. "I think she does." A long silence. The wind pushed at the house, and the house held. "I'm sorry you lost her," Evelyn said. She said it plainly, without anything extra wrapped around it. Not "I'm sorry for your loss" or any of the formal condolence language that people used when they were sorry, but didn't know how to say it. Just, "I'm sorry you lost her." "Thank you," he said, also plainly. They sat like that a while longer, and the fire burned down and Colton added more wood. And they didn't say much else, but it was the kind of silence that had changed its character. Not the silence of 2 strangers in the same house. Something different. Something not yet named. Eat. The trouble started the week after the storms cleared. Colton needed to make a supply run to Granger, and he asked Evelyn to come. He told himself it was practical. She could help choose what was needed, and she hadn't been off the ranch in 6 weeks. He didn't look too closely at whether there were other reasons. Nora came too. She'd made the argument for this herself, at breakfast, with an extended case that covered fairness, boredom, and the fact that Soot would be fine in the barn for a few hours, which nobody had asked about. They drove into Granger on a Tuesday morning, the wagon track ruts frozen hard, the sky clear for the first time in weeks. Nora sat between them on the wagon seat and talked about everything she saw, which was her response to being away from the ranch, a kind of verbal overflow. Evelyn listened and answered and pointed out a hawk on a fence post that Nora would have missed, and Colton drove and listened to them and had the strange, slightly unmoored feeling that this was something he needed to get used to and hadn't yet. Granger was not a large town. It had a main street of maybe 3 blocks, a post office, the hardware store, Henley's general store, a small hotel, a barber shop, and a doctor's office that was only staffed 2 days a week. In summer, it was a reasonable version of a town. In February, it was a cold, wind-scoured version of itself, with most people moving quickly between buildings and not stopping to talk. Colton left Evelyn and Nora at Henley's while he went to the hardware store for the parts he needed. He was gone maybe 25 minutes. When he came back, he could tell before he was fully through the door that something had happened. Nora was standing very close to Evelyn at the fabric counter, closer than she usually stood, the way she stood when she was uncertain or protecting something. Evelyn was standing straight and her face was composed, which Colton had come to understand was not the same as fine. At the other end of the counter, Dora Sims was pretending to look at buttons. 3 other women were nearby in various positions of elaborate nonchalance. He looked at Evelyn. She gave him a slight shake of the head. Barely perceptible, not yet, not in front of Nora. He went to the counter and picked up the flour and the coffee and the tin of baking powder Evelyn had set aside, and he put them on the counter for Henley to tally, and he didn't look at Dora Sims. Dora looked at him. "Colton," she said. The warmth in her voice had the texture of someone trying to make a public overture. "Didn't see you come in. How's the ranch holding up after all this weather?" "Fine," he said. He kept his eyes on Henley tallying the total. "And you're—" A pause, and in that pause was everything. "Your house guest. Settling in?" Colton put his hand flat on the counter. He looked at Dora Sims. "She's not my house guest," he said. His voice was level. "She's my—" And then he stopped, because the word was right there, and also not quite right yet, not in the way he could say it publicly without it being something he hadn't yet earned the right to say. "She's part of my household," he finished, "and she has a name." Dora's expression shifted into something that was almost an apology, but not quite. "Of course," she said. "I didn't mean anything by it." "I know what you meant," he said. He picked up the goods. "Henley." He nodded at the man behind the counter, who had the expression of someone who deeply wished he were somewhere else. He paid. He picked up Nora's hand, and she took it immediately, and he walked out. They were quiet on the wagon ride home. Nora, for once, was quiet too. She had picked up on the temperature of the adults and was watching the country go by without speaking. Colton drove. Evelyn sat on his right side and watched the road. After a while, Nora said, in a careful voice, "Was that lady being mean to Evelyn?" Colton exhaled. "She was being thoughtless," he said. "That's a little different from mean." "It doesn't feel different," Nora said. Evelyn turned to look at her. "You're right," she said. "It doesn't, but sometimes people are thoughtless because they're uncomfortable, not because they're unkind. It's not better exactly, but it's different." Nora considered this. "Do you feel bad?" she asked Evelyn. "A little," Evelyn said. "Honest. But I'm all right." Nora leaned against Evelyn's arm. A small lean, just a slight shift of weight. Evelyn didn't move away from it. Colton kept his eyes on the road. He thought the Henleys' incident was the extent of it. He was wrong. The following Sunday, May came out to the ranch for the first time in weeks, her face carrying the particular expression of a woman who has information she doesn't want to have and feels obligated to share. She waited until Evelyn and Nora had gone out to the barn to check on a hen that had seemed off the day before, and then she sat down across from Colton at the kitchen table with her coffee and said, "There's something going around town I think you should know about." He waited. "Dora Sims has been talking," May said, "more than usual. She's been saying, and I'm not telling you this to upset you. I'm telling you because it's going to get back to you some other way, and I'd rather you hear it plain. She's been saying that a woman who arrives with nothing and agrees to marry a stranger has reasons for it that aren't entirely honest, that there's something she's hiding, that Evelyn might be running from something." May paused. She used the word unsavory. Colton sat very still. "She doesn't know what she's talking about," he said. "No," May agreed. "She doesn't. But she's saying it to enough people in a small enough town that it's starting to stick to the walls. Ruth Calloway repeated it to 3 women at the dressmaker's last Thursday. And you know, once Ruth Calloway says something—" "It doesn't matter," Colton said. "It's gossip." May looked at him with the patience of a woman who had been watching men underestimate social situations for 40 years. "Colton, it doesn't matter to you. I'm not worried about you. I'm worried about Evelyn going into town and hearing what people are saying, and about what that does to a woman who's already had a hard time of it." He stared at the table for a moment. What would you have me do about it? I wouldn't have you do anything right this minute, May said. I'd have you think about it, and I'd have you... She paused, choosing her words. I'd have you be sure of where you stand. Because right now you're between things. You've been careful, which I understand, but carefully being nowhere is still nowhere. And if something's going to be said publicly, it matters who says it and how. After May left, Colton sat at the table for a long time. He had a habit of thinking in straight lines, practical lines, one thing following the next. Right now, the lines were not straight. Right now, they went in several directions at once, and he couldn't find the one that led somewhere clear. The word May had used was unsavory, applied to a woman who had crawled out of the rubble of her family's destruction and rebuilt herself from nothing. And come out here with one bag, and no complaints, and fixed his window frame and his frozen pipe, and his daughter's loneliness without being asked. Unsavory. He got up and went outside and split a considerable amount of wood and did not feel better for it. The following week was when he made the mistake. He hadn't meant to make it the way he made it. He had told Evelyn, in the storage room in January, that it wouldn't happen again. The withdrawal, the careful distance, and he had meant it then. He still meant it, in the abstract. But meaning something and managing it were two different things, and Dora Sims and Ruth Calloway and the weight of what May had told him had gotten into him in a way he couldn't entirely dislodge. It wasn't dramatic. He didn't say anything cruel. He didn't accuse her of anything. He just pulled back again. Ate his meals with his eyes on his plate more than usual, gave shorter answers, found reasons to be in the barn when he might otherwise have been in the house, was civil, was even polite, was just not present in the way he'd been present for the past few weeks. Nora noticed first. She came to him on a Wednesday evening when Evelyn was in her room and stood in the kitchen with her arms crossed and looked at him with the expression of a 6-year-old who had decided to have a difficult conversation. "Papa," she said, "what did you do?" "I didn't do anything." "You're doing the thing." "What thing?" "The quiet thing, where you don't look at people." She tilted her head. "You did it when Soot chewed your good boot and you didn't want to yell at him. And you did it after Mr. Finley's bull got into our fence and you were mad." She uncrossed her arms and crossed them again. "What did Evelyn do?" "Nora, us. Did she do something wrong? Because I haven't seen her do anything wrong." He put down what he was holding. "It's not about anything Evelyn did," he said carefully. "There are... people in town have been saying things, and I'm..." He stopped. He was explaining himself to a 6-year-old, which was both absurd and appropriate because his 6-year-old had correctly identified a problem he couldn't explain to himself. "I'm thinking about things. That's all. I'm not mad at Evelyn." Nora stared at him for a long moment with those brown eyes. "Are you going to make her leave?" she asked. The question hit him in the sternum. "No," he said, "because she thinks you might." Nora said it the way she said things she'd observed but hadn't been asked for. Plainly, without apology. "She gets a look sometimes, like she's figuring out where she'd go." He sat with that. He didn't know what to say to it, so he didn't say anything, and Nora, apparently satisfied that she'd delivered the information she'd come to deliver, uncrossed her arms and went to bed. He sat in the kitchen alone for a long time. The moment came on a Thursday night in the 3rd week of February. He hadn't been able to sleep, hadn't been able to for several nights running, and he'd gotten up at some point past midnight to get water. The house was dark except for the faint ember glow through the stove grate and the thin wash of moonlight through the kitchen window. He moved quietly, not wanting to wake anyone. As he came back through the hallway from the kitchen, he saw light under Nora's door. Not lamplight, softer, a candle maybe. He stopped outside the door and listened. Evelyn's voice, low and even. She was reading. He couldn't make out the words, just the cadence, steady, unhurried, the kind of reading that wasn't performing anything, just being present in it. Then Nora's voice, also low. He still couldn't make the words out. A question. And then Evelyn again. And this time the tone had shifted and he could hear that it wasn't the book anymore. It was conversation. He stood in the dark hallway and listened to the shape of it without hearing the content. And then Nora said something that made Evelyn laugh. That same short, surprised laugh he'd heard in the kitchen on Christmas morning. The one that changed her face completely. And Nora laughed too, and they were quiet for a moment. And then Evelyn's voice came back, softer now. And Nora's responses got shorter, the way they did when she was fighting sleep. And then there was nothing but the low sound of reading again. He stood in the hallway a long time. He was still there when Evelyn came out of Nora's room, pulling the door gently closed behind her. She saw him immediately. He was standing plain in the moonlit hallway, and there was no pretending he hadn't been there. They looked at each other. She had a candle in her hand, low and half burned. Her hair was down. She was in her nightgown with a shawl around her shoulders. She looked at him without apology and without alarm, just looked the way she always looked, directly, like she'd decided long ago that there was no point in looking any other way. He didn't plan what he said next. He'd found over the last 2 months that the things he said to her that mattered weren't the ones he'd planned. "She woke up?" he said. "She was scared," Evelyn said. "She had a dream." "What kind?" Evelyn paused. "She dreamed about her mother. She does sometimes. She didn't want to wake you." She said this last part gently, and he understood she was telling him something about Nora without making it a criticism. Nora hadn't wanted to burden him. She'd gone to Evelyn instead. Something moved in his chest, not a comfortable movement. "What did you—" He stopped. "What did you tell her?" "I told her that the people who love us don't stop doing it just because we can't see them anymore." Evelyn said it quietly. "I don't know if that's true, but it seemed like the thing a scared 6-year-old needed to hear in the middle of the night." He looked at her. In the half-dark of the hallway, she looked tired in a way that she didn't usually let show in daylight. A good tired, maybe. The kind that came from having done something that mattered. "Evelyn," he said. She waited. He had 3 or 4 things he could have said. He chose the most honest one. "I've been pulling back again." Her expression didn't change, but something in her eyes did. "I noticed." "It wasn't about you," he said. "It was about what people are saying in town, and about me being—" He tried to get the word right. "Cowardly," he said finally. "About things I shouldn't be cowardly about." A pause. "You're not cowardly," she said. "I am sometimes." "Everyone is sometimes." She held the candle a little steadier. "Colton, I'm not going to keep—" She stopped. Started again. "I've had people pull back from me before. I know what it looks like, and I know what comes after. And I've been waiting to see if this was that." She looked at him directly. "I'm not sure yet." He held her gaze. "It's not that," he said. "Then what is it?" He was quiet for a moment. The house was so quiet he could hear the fire settling in the stove at the end of the hall. "I don't know what I'm doing," he said. "Not with the ranch, not with Nora. Those things I know, but this—" He made a gesture that took in the hallway, the dark house, probably more than that. "I haven't done this before. Not since Clara. And I keep—" He stopped. "I keep waiting for myself to figure out what the right thing to do is, and I think I'm waiting too long." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. Her face was very quiet. "You don't have to figure it all out at once," she said. "But you do need to stop disappearing on me when things get hard. Because I can—" Her voice went slightly tighter. Not much, just enough that he heard it. "I can manage most things. I've managed most things for a long time, but I can't manage not knowing where I stand." "That's fair," he said. "I know it's fair," she said. "I need to know if you agree." He looked at her face in the candlelight, steady and tired and honest, at the shawl slightly crooked on her shoulder, at the candle dripping wax over her fingers because she'd been holding it too long. "I agree," he said. Neither of them said anything for a while after that. They stood in the hallway in the half-dark with the sound of the sleeping house around them. "You should go to bed," she said finally. "You're up before dawn." "So are you." "I know." She shifted the candle. "Go to bed, Colton." He almost said something else. He let it go. He went back to his room and lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling. And what he felt was not resolved. He didn't think things were resolved, not yet, maybe not for a while, but it was different. It was something. Across the hall, Nora was asleep with her quilt pulled up, her breathing slow and even, dreaming whatever she dreamed now that the scared part of the night had passed. By morning, he had made a decision, though he hadn't quite called it that yet. He had come to it in the hour before dawn when the house was still dark, and the ranch sat under its covering of snow, and the sky was beginning to go pale in the east. He'd lain there and thought about what May had said, and what Nora had said, and what Evelyn had said in the hallway, and he'd thought about Dora Sims and Ruth Calloway and every person in Granger who had formed an opinion about a woman they'd never spoken to, and he'd thought about standing at a wagon counter in Henley's with his hand flat on the wood and not finishing the sentence he'd needed to finish. He got up. He made coffee. He went out and did the morning chores. He came back in and ate breakfast with Nora and Evelyn, and the three of them were quiet in the way that people are quiet when something is about to change and they can feel it, but don't yet know exactly what it is. He looked across the table at Evelyn. She was helping Nora cut her cornbread into careful, even pieces the way Nora inexplicably insisted her cornbread be cut. She was not looking at him. He watched her for a moment, her hands patient and certain, her face concentrating on Nora's plate. And he felt the thing he'd been not feeling and not naming for 2 months settle into something clear and specific and not particularly convenient. He looked back at his coffee. All right, he thought, all right. Outside, the February sky was hard and blue and cold, and the snow lay over the ranch in its deep, indifferent white. And somewhere in the distance, one of the cattle was making noise about something, and the day was starting the way days started out here, with everything still unresolved and still requiring attention, and still, despite everything, worth getting up for. Inside, the three of them had breakfast, and the fire burned, and Nora got cornbread on her sleeve and didn't notice, and Evelyn noticed and didn't say anything, just handed her a cloth, and the morning went on. He spent 3 days working out what he wanted to say. That wasn't like him. Colton Hale was not a man who rehearsed things. He said what needed saying when it needed saying, and he didn't labor over the architecture of it. But this was different, and he knew it was different, and he gave it the time it deserved, even though the time made him restless in a way that had him going out to split wood twice a day and still coming in with too much energy for his hands. The decision itself had arrived cleanly, the way the important ones sometimes did. Not with fanfare, not with a moment of dramatic clarity, just as a fact he woke up knowing on a Thursday morning in the last week of February, as settled and ordinary as the weight of his boots on the floor. He was going to ask Evelyn to stay, not as an arrangement, not as a practical solution to a practical problem. As his wife, genuinely, in the full meaning of the word that he'd been carefully avoiding looking directly at for 2 months. The how was the harder part. He was aware that he had not been easy. He was aware that he had pulled back twice when she'd needed steadiness, that he had stood in a general store and not finished a sentence he should have finished, that he had spent the better part of a month being cautious in a way that Evelyn, who had a precise and unsentimental reading of people, had seen clearly and had been hurt by even though she hadn't said so in those words. He was aware that an apology was required, a real one, not the halting version he'd offered in the storage room in January, and that what came after the apology needed to be said plainly, without hedging, because Evelyn did not respond to hedging and she'd earned plain speech. What he didn't know was how to do any of this in a way that felt like himself, and not like a man performing a scene from a story. He thought about it while he fixed the south fence line on Thursday. He thought about it while he was in the barn on Friday, rehanging the stall door that had been giving him trouble all winter. On Saturday morning, with Nora at May's for the day, May had offered to take her, which Colton suspected was not unconnected to May having opinions about what Colton needed time to do. He sat at the kitchen table with his coffee and looked at his hands and thought about it some more. What he arrived at, eventually, was that there was no version of this that wasn't going to be imperfect. He was going to say it wrong in at least one place. He was going to leave something out that he meant to include. He was going to stand there with his hands doing something awkward because he'd never known what to do with his hands in moments like this. That was all right. Evelyn didn't need perfect. She'd said as much in her way. She needed honest. He went to the barn. There was a piece of wood he'd been working on, off and on, for the past 2 weeks. A small thing, not much bigger than his palm. A scrap of good pine that he'd smoothed and shaped in the evenings after Nora was in bed when he needed something for his hands to do. He hadn't let himself think too directly about what he was making or why. He'd just made it. It was a flower. A simple one, 4 petals and a center, carved with the small knife he used for fine work, the lines clean and deliberate. Not art, not elegant, just something made carefully by hands that knew how to make things carefully. He picked it up from the shelf and turned it over. There was a rough place on one petal where he'd gone too deep with the knife and had to work it out, and you could still see the correction if you looked closely. He'd thought about making another one, starting over, getting it right. He hadn't. He'd kept this one. He set it in his coat pocket and went back inside. He'd also been thinking about the ring. Clara's wedding ring was in the small wooden box in the top drawer of his bureau, where it had been since October of the year she died. He'd put it there that morning after, and he hadn't opened the drawer very often since. It wasn't a fine ring. He hadn't had much money when he and Clara married. A thin band of gold with a small setting, nothing elaborate. Clara had loved it specifically because it wasn't elaborate, which was her. She'd had no patience for fuss. He sat on the edge of his bed and opened the drawer and held the box for a while without opening it. He wasn't sure exactly what the right thing to do was here. On one side, it was the only ring he had, and Evelyn deserved something real, not a piece of carved wood. On the other side, it had been Clara's. It had been on Clara's hand for 14 years. There was a weight to that, a specific gravity that he didn't want to ignore or handle carelessly. He thought about what Clara would have said. She would have said, and he knew this because he had known her thoroughly, the way you know a person after 14 years. She would have said, "Colton, stop sitting on the bed with a box in your hands and making it complicated." She would have said it with affection, probably, and some exasperation, because she had loved him and had also been frequently exasperated with him, which was accurate. He opened the box. The ring sat in the small depression in the velvet interior, exactly where he'd left it. He picked it up and held it between his thumb and forefinger and looked at it in the gray morning light. He thought about Evelyn's hands, the red knuckles in the cold, the careful evenness of her mending stitches, the way she laid her fingers flat on the table when she was saying something true. He thought about the kind of woman who wrote letters to a stranger about his daughter's favorite stories before she even knew if she was coming. He closed his hand around the ring. He put it in his shirt pocket next to where the carved flower was in his coat. He went to put more wood on the stove. He waited. Evelyn came in from the root cellar mid-morning with a basket of stored vegetables, carrots and potatoes that had kept well, and set them on the counter and began sorting through them the way she always did, pulling out anything that had started to go soft and setting it aside for the stock pot. She had her back to the room. She didn't know yet that Nora was gone, or she did know and hadn't remarked on it, which was also like her. "Nora's at May's," Colton said. "I know." She didn't turn around. "May told me last week she was going to take her for a Saturday." He paused. "You knew May planned it." "May doesn't do anything without planning it." A slight pause. "She worries about you. She thinks you need time to think without Nora interrupting." He stood in the kitchen doorway. "Were you in on it?" Now she turned. Her expression was not quite amused, but it had the edge of it. "No, but I'm not surprised." She looked at him for a moment and then back at the vegetables. "Did you eat this morning?" "I had coffee." "That's not eating." "I know." She moved to the stove and started water going for the potatoes. He stayed in the doorway. He had planned to wait until later, until he'd found the right moment, which he'd been vaguely imagining as something with more lead up to it, more natural arrival. But she was standing at the stove with her hair pulled back and her sleeves rolled up and the morning light coming sideways through the kitchen window. And there was nothing staged about any of it, which was probably exactly right. "Evelyn," he said. She turned. "Come sit down." She looked at him. She had a way of reading tone precisely. He'd noticed that about her from the beginning, and whatever she read in his voice now made something change in her expression. Not alarm. More like careful alertness, like a person who has learned not to assume things are good before she knows what they are. She came and sat at the table. He came and sat across from her. He put his hands on the table and then moved them and then put them back, which was the awkward hands thing he'd predicted and could apparently do nothing about. "I want to say something to you," he said, "and I want to say it right, which means I need you to not—" He paused. "Just let me get through it before you say anything." She looked at him steadily, nodded once. He took a breath. "I've done this wrong," he said. "Not everything, but the important parts. I've done wrong. And I want to be straight with you about that before I say anything else. I told you in January that I wouldn't pull back again, and I did it anyway. I stood in Henley's store, and I didn't say what I should have said because I was being—" He stopped. "I was afraid of something. I'm not entirely sure what. Of committing to something I couldn't take back, maybe. Of being wrong about someone again and having to live in that. He looked at his hands. That wasn't fair to you. You've been straight with me from the start. You've been honest about who you are and where you came from and what you could do. And I've been sitting here measuring it all with a scale I should have put down a long time ago. Evelyn didn't say anything. She was holding very still in the way she held still when something mattered. You came here with one bag, he said. I know what I thought when I saw that. I'm not proud of it, but that's what I thought, that a woman who came with so little must not have much to offer. He looked up at her. I was wrong. You had more in that one bag than some people carry in a whole wagon load. He paused. The window frame, the pipe in the crawl space, the curtain hem, the way you sit with Nora when she reads, the way you answered her at 3 a.m. when she was scared and didn't want to wake me. He stopped again. I'm not saying this well. You're saying it fine, she said quietly. Let me finish. He reached into his coat pocket and brought out the wooden flower. He set it on the table between them. She looked at it. She didn't reach for it. I made this, he said, which was obvious and which he said anyway. There's a rough place on one of the petals where I made a mistake and had to correct it. I thought about starting over and I decided not to. He pushed it slightly closer to her. I don't know that I have a better way of explaining what I'm trying to say than that. Evelyn looked at the flower. Something was happening in her face. Not tears, not yet, but the effort of keeping things contained, which he recognized because he did the same thing. He reached into his shirt pocket. He set the ring on the table beside the flower. She looked at it. A long look. That's Clara's, she said. It was Clara's, he said. She's been gone 2 years, and I've been... He put his hand flat on the table. I've been treating the grief like a wall I had to stay behind. Like staying there was a way of honoring her, but I think it was just easier than coming out. He looked at Evelyn. You didn't knock the wall down. You just stood on the other side of it long enough that staying behind it started to seem like the wrong choice. Evelyn's eyes were bright. She was not going to cry. She was the kind of person who made that decision and held to it. I want to ask you something, he said. Not because we made an arrangement, not because Nora needs a mother, though she does, and I'm grateful for what you've given her. I'm more grateful than I know how to say. But because you are... He stopped, tried again. You're someone I want in my life, not on the edge of it, in it. He met her eyes. Will you stay? Properly. As my wife. Not an arrangement. A choice. The kitchen was very quiet. The water on the stove was beginning to bubble faintly. Outside somewhere a bird, the first one he'd heard since December, made a single sound and went quiet. Evelyn looked at the flower. She looked at the ring. She looked at him. You're asking me, she said. Yes. Not because of Nora. Not only because of Nora. She looked at him for a long moment. He sat with it. He didn't rush it. He'd said what he had to say, and he was going to let it be what it was. I need to tell you something first, she said. He waited. I almost left, she said, 3 weeks ago, when things were cold again. I lay in that room at night and I thought about where I'd go and how long the money I had would last and what I'd do when it ran out. She said it plainly, without drama. I didn't leave because of Nora. That was the reason I stayed in my room and didn't go. Not because I thought things would get better, just because I couldn't make myself walk away from her. She paused. I need you to know that, because if you're asking me to stay, I need you to know that I'm not easy to shake loose once I'm committed. But I've been shaken loose before and I know what it does to me, and I won't go through that again. I know, he said. Do you? Evelyn. He held her gaze. I know, and I'm not... He exhaled. I'm not going to do that again. I can't promise I won't be difficult. I'm sure I will be. But I won't disappear on you. I promise you that specifically. She held his gaze for a long moment, reading him. He let her read him. He didn't try to look more certain than he was, or less scared than he was. He just let her see it. Then she reached across the table and picked up the carved flower. She turned it in her fingers. She found the rough place on the petal where he'd corrected the mistake, and she ran her thumb across it. Yes, she said. He breathed out. He hadn't known how much he'd been holding until he let it go. Yes, she said again, quieter, like she was saying it to herself as much as to him. He picked up the ring from the table. He didn't ask. He reached across and took her left hand, and she let him take it, and he put the ring on her finger. It was slightly loose. He'd have to get it sized, eventually, if she wanted that. Right now she looked at it on her hand, and her expression was something he didn't have a precise word for. Not happiness, exactly. Or not only that. Something bigger than happiness. Something that had cost more to arrive at. I'm going to fix the ring, he said. Get it fitted properly. Don't rush, she said. All right. She was still looking at her hand. He was still holding it across the table. He didn't let go right away, and she didn't pull back. I have one condition, she said. He raised an eyebrow. You teach Nora to fix a fence line properly this spring, she said. She's been watching you do it all winter, and she wants to learn, and you keep telling her she's too small. He looked at her. She's 6. She's capable, Evelyn said. She just needs someone to show her. A pause. That's not a small thing, Colton. A girl who grows up knowing she can fix what's broken doesn't grow up scared of things being broken. He held her gaze. He thought about a 61-year-old man and a daughter who had learned to fix things because there wasn't always money to pay someone else to do it. He thought about what that woman had built out of what that learning had given her. All right, he said. This spring. She nodded. They sat like that a moment longer, his hand over hers, the wooden flower in her other hand, the ring on her finger, the kitchen warm around them. Then she pulled her hand back gently and stood up and went to check the water on the stove, which was boiling now, and he sat at the table and watched her and felt not fixed exactly, not like everything was resolved or simple or done, more like a door that had been frozen shut had been opened, and the air coming through it was cold, the way new air was always cold, but it was moving. It was real. Nora came home at midday, dropped off by May with the efficiency of a woman who had correctly guessed that her timing mattered and had timed it accordingly. She came through the door at full noise, coat half on, one boot unlaced, telling a story about a crow that had landed on May's fence post and stolen a piece of cornbread, and she was halfway through it before she registered that the kitchen was different. She stopped. She looked at Evelyn. She looked at Colton. Her eyes went to Evelyn's left hand, which was holding the ladle she'd been stirring soup with. Nora walked across the kitchen, looked at the ring, and looked at Evelyn's face. Did you say yes? She asked. I said yes, Evelyn said. Nora turned to look at her father. Colton had been prepared mostly for a range of responses. He was not quite prepared for the one he got. Nora walked to Evelyn and put her arms around her waist. Not a big dramatic gesture. She did it the way she did things that mattered to her, with a quiet certainty, like she was closing a distance she'd been aware of for a long time. Evelyn's hand came down onto her back, the one holding the ladle, which she transferred quickly to the other hand so she could put the right one around Nora's shoulders. They stood like that for a moment. Then Nora said into Evelyn's side, Does that make you my mother now? A silence. It makes me your Evelyn, Evelyn said quietly. That's what it makes me. Whatever that means to you, that's what it means. Nora was quiet for a moment. I already had a mother, she said. It wasn't sad exactly. It was the plain, clear-eyed statement of a child who had thought about this seriously. I know you're not her. I know I'm not, Evelyn said. But you're something, Nora said. You're something different. She stepped back and looked up at Evelyn's face. I don't have a word for it. We don't need one yet, Evelyn said. Nora nodded, satisfied with this. She went to the table and climbed onto her chair and said, What's for lunch? In her ordinary voice, and the kitchen resumed its ordinary sounds, and Colton sat at the table and watched the two of them, and felt the strange new weight of a life-changing direction. Not violently, not all at once, but genuinely. The way real things changed. May came by that afternoon, officially to return a pot she'd borrowed 2 weeks ago. She stood in the kitchen doorway with the pot and looked at the ring on Evelyn's finger and looked at Colton and said nothing for a moment. Then she said to Evelyn, About time. Evelyn looked slightly amused. That's what you have to say? That's what I have to say. She set the pot on the counter. You need anything from me between now and whenever you want to make this official? We haven't talked about that yet, Colton said. We'll talk about it, May said. She looked at Evelyn again. You doing all right? I'm doing well, Evelyn said. Something in her voice had shifted from the way she usually said, I'm fine. The routine, self-contained version. She said this one differently. It had something open in it. Really well. May nodded like this was the only acceptable answer. She said goodbye to Nora, who grabbed her arm and insisted on finishing the crow story she'd been telling when she arrived, and then May left, and the afternoon light came in long and low through the windows, and the ranch sat under its last deep covering of snow, and the house was full of noise, which was Nora talking about crows, and warmth, and the smell of soup, and a woman standing at the stove with a ring on her finger that was slightly too large, and a man at the table listening. He'd been listening more lately. He hadn't noticed that until now. Outside, the light was already going. The days were getting longer, barely, just a few minutes more each week, but long enough to notice if you were paying attention. The cold was still hard, still everywhere, still capable of damage. But the quality of it had changed somehow. The winter wasn't ending, but it was past the worst. Later, after soup and bread, and the extended negotiation that was Nora's bedtime, Colton found Evelyn on the porch. She'd come out for some reason. Air, maybe, or just the habit of watching the night settle in that he'd noticed in her. She had her coat on and her arms crossed, looking out at the snow-covered yard, the dark line of the tree break to the north, the stars coming out hard and bright in the cold. He came out and stood beside her. He hadn't brought his coat. He immediately regretted not bringing his coat. You'll freeze, she said without looking at him. I'll go in a minute. You'll go in now. You've got work at dawn. He didn't move. She looked at him sideways. He looked straight out at the yard. Evelyn, he said. Colton, I know it's not going to be... He stopped. Things are going to be hard sometimes. The ranch has bad years. The weather is what it is out here, and I'm... He made a slight gesture at himself that was meant to convey I am what I am. I'm better than I've been lately, but I'm not... Colton, she said. What? I know, she said. I've been standing in hard things for 10 years. I'm not expecting easy. She looked back out at the yard. I'm expecting honest. I'm expecting you to mean what you say. That's all. He stood beside her in the cold. I mean it, he said. I know, she said again. Quieter. They stood for another minute. The cold was doing serious work on his ears and his hands. He was going to have to go in. The flower, she said. He looked at her. I put it on the windowsill in my room, she said. The wooden one, she paused, where I can see it. He didn't say anything. He felt the need to say something and overrode it, which for him was an act of some discipline. Go inside, she said. You're shivering. He was. He went inside. He put wood on the fire and stood close to the stove for a while until the feeling came back into his hands, and he heard the porch door open and Evelyn come back in and close it behind her. And the house held the sound of two people in separate rooms doing the quiet things that end a day. He thought of what was still undone, things that were always undone, on a ranch, the list that never shortened. He thought about the fence line he'd promised Nora she could help fix in spring. He thought about getting the ring sized. He thought about what the town would say and what he would say back, which was a conversation he was going to need to have and was not particularly dreading the way he would have dreaded it a month ago. He banked the fire for the night and went to bed. Through the wall he could hear nothing, just the house settling in the cold, the way it always did, the sounds of a building that had been through enough winters to know what it was doing. And somewhere in that silence was the ring on her finger and the flower on her windowsill and a child asleep in the next room who had put her arms around someone and held on. He pulled his blanket up. Outside, the last of February's stars burned in the black Wyoming sky, cold and constant, indifferent to everything below them the way only very old things could be indifferent. The ranch sat in its snow. The barn sat dark. The road ran out through the flats and disappeared. Inside, someone had made a choice. Two people had, really, and the house felt different for it, not transformed, not suddenly bright the way things were bright in stories when they resolved, just different. Warmer by some small degrees, inhabited in a way it hadn't been for a long time. That was enough. That was more than enough. March came in the way it always did in Wyoming, not gently, not with any of the softness that the word spring implied somewhere else in the country. It came in cold and argumentative, with wind that still had winter's teeth in it, and nights that still dropped below freezing, and mornings that still required breaking ice off the water trough. But the light had changed. That was the thing about March on the high plains. The temperature lied, but the light didn't. The days were longer now in a way you could measure, and the sun, when it came out, had an angle to it that February's sun hadn't had. It hit the snow differently. It made the yard look like it was thinking about something. Colton noticed it on a Monday morning, standing at the pump with his breath-making clouds. He noticed the light, and he noticed that he was noticing it, which was different from how he'd been 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks ago, he'd been getting through the days. Now he was in them in a way that felt different, more present, more here. He'd thought about that some. Not obsessively, not in the way he'd always distrusted. Men who sat around examining their own feelings struck him as men who weren't doing enough work. But in the quiet morning moments before the house woke up, standing at the stove with his first coffee, he'd let himself think about what had changed and why. What had changed was not a mystery. What surprised him was the texture of it, that falling towards something good could feel as disorienting as falling towards something bad. That choosing to let a wall down could leave you as cold and exposed as losing it unwillingly. He'd expected the decision to bring a kind of relief, and it had, but the relief had come wrapped in something rawer and less comfortable that he was still working through. Something that had to do with deserving things, with being allowed to want them. He didn't say this to Evelyn, not in those words, but one morning she'd come into the kitchen and found him standing at the window for no apparent reason, and she'd stood in the doorway looking at him, and he'd turned around and she'd said, "You're allowed," which was either a remarkable coincidence or she'd been watching him long enough to read what was on his face. He'd said, "I know," and she'd said, "Keep knowing it," and she'd gone to the stove, and that had been that. She had a quality he hadn't had a word for until recently, and the word he'd landed on was precision. She said exact things, not sharp, not blunt, exact. Like she measured the thing she needed to communicate, found the smallest true version of it, and said that. No extra around the edges. He'd spent his life surrounded by people who said too much of the wrong thing and too little of what mattered. And the economy of her speech was something he'd come to depend on without realizing he was depending on it. The ring had been sized. He'd driven to Granger in the second week of March and left it with the jeweler for 2 days and brought it back fitted properly to her finger. She'd put it on without ceremony and gone back to what she was doing, and that too was right. The question of what to do about Granger had been sitting at the back of his mind since February. Not urgently. There were too many immediate things requiring attention to let anything sit at the front of his mind for long, but persistently. May had told him the talk was still going, not louder than before, but not gone either. The way small-town talk didn't go anywhere it wasn't pushed out of. Dora Sims had apparently expanded her theory to include a few additional speculations that May relayed to Colton with the expression of a woman who found the whole thing distasteful but felt obligated to report accurately. He'd listened and he'd said he'd deal with it, and May had said when, and he'd said when the time is right, and May had given him a look that communicated precisely what she thought about that answer. Evelyn hadn't asked him about it. She knew he was thinking about it. She read him well enough to know when something was sitting in the back of his mind. But she didn't push. She'd told him what she needed from him in February, and he'd promised it, and pushing him on the pace of delivery wasn't her way. What decided it was a Saturday in the third week of March. He'd gone into Granger for feed, alone, and he was loading the bags into the wagon bed when he heard a voice behind him that he recognized. It was a woman he didn't know well, Helen Marsh, whose husband ran the livery, talking to someone on the other side of the wagon that he couldn't see. They hadn't noticed him. "Well, what I heard is she left Missouri under not the best of circumstances," Helen was saying, the cheerful tone of someone delivering a story they found interesting. "Something about a situation with a man. That's what Dora said. Some kind of—" Colton set down the bag he was holding. He came around the back of the wagon. Helen Marsh stopped talking. She looked at him. The woman beside her, someone he'd seen in the dressmaker's but didn't know, looked at him. "Mrs. Marsh," he said. Helen Marsh recovered quickly. "Colton, I didn't see you there." "I noticed that." He kept his voice even. "I'm going to ask you to do something for me." She waited, with the expression of a woman who suspected she wasn't going to enjoy this. Stop saying things about my wife that you know aren't true, he said. Whatever Dora Sims told you, and whatever you've added to it, and whatever you plan to pass on from here, stop. A silence. I wasn't, Helen started. You were, he said. I heard you. He picked up the last feed bag. Evelyn Hart is going to be Evelyn Hale by the end of this month. She came here with nothing because someone took everything from her and she built herself back up out of what was left. That's not something to talk about behind a wagon. That's something you respect. He put the bag in the wagon bed. I'd appreciate it if you'd let the rest of town know I said so. He climbed up onto the seat and picked up the reins. Helen Marsh was still standing there with an expression that had moved from uncomfortable to something that might, eventually, in a charitable reading, be called ashamed. The woman beside her was looking at her shoes. Colton drove out of Granger without looking back. He told Evelyn that night. He'd been uncertain about whether to tell her, uncertain whether it would feel like he'd done something on her behalf that she'd rather have done herself or hadn't wanted done. But he told her, and he watched her face while he told her, and what crossed it was not annoyance or discomfort. It was something that moved through quickly and left her face very still. You said that, she said. To Helen Marsh. Yes. In the middle of the street. By the wagon. Close enough. She looked at the table for a moment. When she looked back up at him, her eyes were bright in the way they'd been bright the morning he'd asked her to stay. You didn't have to do that, she said. I know. I've been dealing with people saying things about me for a long time, she said. I know how to manage it. I know you do, he said. But you shouldn't have to. Not here. Not about things that aren't true. He held her gaze. That's not me saying you can't handle it. You can handle anything. That's me saying I'm not going to stand next to a wagon and pretend I don't hear it. She was quiet for a moment. Was she embarrassed? She asked. He thought about it. Eventually, he said, something flickered at the corner of her mouth. Good, she said quietly. He hadn't planned on making a public declaration. That wasn't in his character. He was a man who dealt with things directly and specifically, not a man who stood in public squares and made speeches. But what happened the following Saturday was not entirely a speech, and it was not entirely planned, and it came out of a sequence of events that had their own momentum. They went into Granger together, all three of them, Colton, Evelyn, Nora, on the wagon, Nora between them in her good coat with her hair braided the way Evelyn had braided it, 2 plaits and a ribbon on each end. They had genuine errands, the post office, the general store, the jeweler's because Evelyn needed thread, and the dressmaker's was next door, ordinary Saturday business. But Colton drove in knowing what he was driving into, and Evelyn sat beside him knowing it too, and neither of them said anything about it to Nora, who was telling a long and detailed story about something Soot had done with a piece of cornbread, which was apparently a recurring theme with cornbread and animals in Nora's world. They tied the wagon on the main street and walked together toward the post office. And Colton was aware, in the way you become aware when you have been invisible and then become visible, that they were being looked at. Not dramatically, not with pointing, just the small collected attention of a town that had been talking about something and was now seeing the subject of that talk walking down their street with her head up and a ring on her finger and her hand resting in the crook of a man's arm. Colton felt Evelyn's hand in the crook of his arm, and he held his elbow slightly more firmly against his side, which was the only signal he could give her without saying anything. She gave a slight pressure back. She knew. They went to the post office. There was a letter from the agency, a routine follow-up that the agency sent out every few months, and he tucked it in his coat, and they came back out onto the street. Dora Sims was coming out of the dressmaker's as they reached it. It was not planned. She came through the door, and they were right there, 3 of them, and she stopped on the step above the sidewalk and looked at them with the expression of a woman who has just found herself in a situation she'd been picturing differently in her head. Nora looked up at her. Hello, she said, because Nora had no complicated feelings about Dora Sims. Nora had not been told about Dora Sims. Dora Sims looked down at Nora, and something in her face moved that was not entirely uncomplicated. Children had a way of making things harder to maintain. Hello, she said. This is Evelyn, Nora said, with the confidence of someone introducing someone important. She's going to be my... She's Evelyn. She lives with us. She fixed our window and she knows how to set a snare and she reads really well. A pause. She's going to marry Papa. Dora Sims looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked at her. Evelyn's face was composed and her chin was level, and she did not look like someone who was managing something. She looked like someone who had nothing to manage. She looked like herself. "Mrs. Sims," Evelyn said, politely, with the specific politeness of a woman who could afford to be polite because she was not the one who had been wrong. A silence sat on the step between them. Colton was about to say something. He had something ready, measured, not cruel but clear, when Dora Sims did something he hadn't expected. She said, "Miss Hart, I owe you an apology." The sidewalk was quiet enough that people nearby heard it. Colton saw a man in front of the hardware store stop what he was doing without turning around. Dora Sims stepped down off the dressmaker's step. She was a big woman, solid, with a face that had the weathered redness of someone who'd spent years in Wyoming sun, and right now that face had the particular expression of a woman who was doing something that cost her something and had decided to pay it. "I said things I had no business saying," she said. She was talking to Evelyn. "About your character. About your reasons for being here. I didn't know you. I hadn't spoken to you. I was—" She stopped. Started again. "I was unkind. And I was wrong." Evelyn held her gaze. A long moment. Colton could feel her stillness beside him. The specific stillness that was not coldness, but was the steady gathering of herself that she did when something required her full weight. "Thank you," Evelyn said. "I appreciate that." Dora Sims nodded. She looked briefly at Colton. And he gave her a slight nod in return. Not warm, not cold, just acknowledging. She walked on down the sidewalk, and behind her the street resumed its ordinary noise. Nora tugged Evelyn's hand. "What was that about?" she asked. "That woman realized she'd made a mistake and said so," Evelyn said. "Is that hard?" "For some people," Evelyn said. "Yes." Nora thought about this for a few paces. "I think it's better to say sorry even if it's hard," she said. "It is," Evelyn agreed. Colton said nothing. He kept walking. He was aware that something had shifted in the few minutes that had taken. Something in the air on the main street of Granger. Something in the way 3 or 4 people who had been watching had gone back to their own business with a different piece of information than they'd had before. He hadn't made a speech. He hadn't needed to. It had been Dora Sims who'd said the thing that mattered, and it had been Evelyn who'd received it with the exact right proportion of dignity and absence of cruelty, which was as much a character demonstration as anything she could have planned. They went into the dressmakers and bought thread. They went to Henley's and got what they needed. On the way back to the wagon, they ran into Tom Henley's wife, Ruth Calloway, before she married, who had been at the station in December and had told Dora Sims what she'd seen there and started the whole chain of talk. Ruth Calloway Henley stopped in front of them on the sidewalk. She was a small, precise woman who reminded Colton of a bird, quick-eyed and alert. She looked at Evelyn. "Mrs. Is it Hale yet?" she said. "Soon," Evelyn said. "Well." Ruth looked at her. She seemed to be making a calculation. "I'm Ruth Henley. My husband runs the general store. If you need anything run to the ranch when the roads are bad, we can usually arrange it. For the regulars." It was not an apology, it was an extension of ordinary commerce. But the way it was offered, the specificity of it, the acknowledging of Evelyn as someone who would be a regular, someone who belonged in the regular economy of this town, was its own kind of statement. "That's useful to know," Evelyn said. "Thank you." Ruth nodded crisply and walked on. Colton exhaled. "Are they all going to do that now?" Nora asked. "Do what?" Evelyn asked. "Say things at us." "Some of them," Colton said. "Is that good or bad?" He glanced down at her. "Better than the alternative." They were nearly back to the wagon when a man Colton knew slightly, Ed Bauer, who ran a small operation north of town, who Colton had helped pull a stuck wagon out of a ditch 2 winters ago, appeared from the direction of the hardware store and stopped in front of them. He was a big, quiet man who did not say more than he meant to, and he looked at Colton and then at Evelyn and then back at Colton. "Heard you're getting married," he said. "Yes," Colton said. Ed Bauer looked at Evelyn. "Congratulations," he said. Just that. Then he walked on. Nora watched him go. That was nice, she decided. Yes, Evelyn said. She was watching him too, with something in her expression that Colton caught the edge of. Not surprise exactly, but the look of someone recalculating the size of a thing. She'd been measuring the town by its worst voices for 3 months. She was beginning to see that wasn't all of it. The towns, like people, were not singular in what they were. He put his hand briefly on her back. A light touch, barely there, the gesture of a man who was still learning the ordinary vocabulary of this and was practicing. And she didn't move away from it. They walked to the wagon. On the ride home, Nora fell asleep somewhere past the edge of town, her head against Evelyn's arm, her good coat bundled up around her. The road ran out through the open country, the snow still covering the flats, but thinner now, gray-white and granular, the kind of snow that was giving up. The sky was pale blue and enormous, and the sun was out. Evelyn was looking at the country. She'd started doing that, looking at the country the way she'd looked at it on the wagon in December, taking inventory, but differently now. Then she'd been cataloging it. Now she was living in it. There was a difference, and it was visible on her face if you were paying attention, and Colton was paying attention. I want to tell you something, she said. He waited. When I got on the train in Missouri, she said, I didn't know if this was going to work. I mean, I knew what the letter said and I knew what the arrangement was. But I didn't know if there was enough left in me to build anything. I'd been building and losing and building and losing for 10 years, and I thought, she paused. I thought maybe I'd used up the part of me that could want things. He listened. I hadn't, she said. She said it the way she said the things that cost her something, plainly, without ornamentation. But it took time. And it took Nora. And it took you being wrong a few times and then doing better. She looked at him. I want you to know that the doing better part matters. The people who do better, that's not nothing. Most people don't. He looked at her for a moment, then back at the road. He had the feeling, strong and specific, that he was being told something important about her history that she hadn't said directly before. That there had been people before this who had done worse and not done better. He didn't ask about it. He'd learn it in time, or he wouldn't need to, either way. I'm going to keep doing it, he said. Better. I know, she said. That's the only reason I'm sitting here. Nora shifted in her sleep, her weight more fully against Evelyn's arm, and Evelyn adjusted slightly so she wouldn't tip. An unconscious accommodation, the kind you made for someone whose weight you'd already incorporated into your sense of things. Quote. They were married on a Friday in early April in May's front room, which was the largest room available to them, and which May had cleared of most of its furniture for the occasion. The justice of the peace was a lean man named Cutter, who did the civil ceremonies in Granger and who got through the words efficiently and without embellishment, which was exactly what both of them wanted. May was there. May had not cried at her own husband's funeral 30 years ago, which was either a remarkable feat of composure or a statement about the marriage. And she did not cry at this wedding, but she held herself with a particular erectness during the ceremony that was, for May, the equivalent of tears. Nora stood beside Evelyn and held her hand throughout, which had not been planned. When they'd arrived, Nora had taken Evelyn's hand and not let go, and nobody had suggested she should. The ring was already on Evelyn's finger, the properly fitted ring, Clara's ring sized down to fit. So there was no ring exchange. What there was at the end, when Cutter said the last words, was a moment in which Colton looked at Evelyn and Evelyn looked at him. And what passed between them was not the bright, uncomplicated thing that happened at the weddings Colton had seen in his life. It was something that had already been through weather, something that knew what it had cost to arrive. He kissed her. It was brief and not elegant. He'd never been elegant, and she had her hand on his arm. Nora made a sound that was somewhere between pleased and grossed out, which was appropriate. May said, "All right," in the tone of a woman who considered the matter settled and had things to do, and she went to the kitchen to get the cake she'd made, which Nora immediately followed her to see about. Colton and Evelyn stood in May's cleared front room, alone for a moment. "All right," Evelyn said. "Yeah," he said. She looked at his face. He looked at hers. There wasn't anything to say that covered it, so they didn't try. They ate cake. Nora ate more cake than was reasonable, and nobody stopped her because it was a particular kind of day. May told a story about her own wedding that Colton had never heard before, and that made Evelyn laugh 3 separate times. Cutter stayed for a piece of cake and left with the particular efficiency of a man who performed multiple ceremonies on Fridays and had a schedule. On the drive home, Nora sat between them again and didn't fall asleep this time. She was full of cake and full of the particular buzzing aliveness of a child who had been at a party. She asked questions about weddings in general, and theirs in particular, and about whether there would be any more cake and whether Soot could have a piece. "Soot cannot have cake," Colton said. "Why not?" "Because he's a dog, and sugar isn't good for dogs." "He'd like it, though." "Nora, I'm just saying he would like it." She sat back. She was quiet for approximately 45 seconds, which was an unusually long silence for Nora. Then she said, "Are we a family now?" The question sat on the wagon seat between all 3 of them. Colton opened his mouth and then closed it, because the answer was yes, but yes felt insufficient, and he was still working out what the full answer was. Evelyn said, "We've been a family for a while now. Today, it's just official." Nora considered this. When did it start? "When you held my hand getting off the wagon in December," Evelyn said, "and didn't let go when we went inside." Nora thought about this for a while. Then she said, "I don't remember doing that." "I know," Evelyn said. "That's how I knew you meant it." Nora seemed to find this philosophically satisfying. She leaned forward and looked at the horse, and then leaned back and looked at the sky, and then leaned against Evelyn's arm and stayed there. They drove the rest of the way home in the particular easy quiet of people who have found their configuration. The country opened up on both sides of the road, the snow still patchy on the flats, but pulling back from the higher ground, the grass underneath it brown and matted, but there. Still there, the way it always was. Waiting. Boom. Colton saw them the next morning. He'd gone out at first light to do the animals, the same as every morning, and on the way back to the house, he stopped at the base of the porch steps. There, in the narrow strip of ground between the steps and the south wall of the house, the most sheltered place, the place where the winter had pressed least hard, there were 3 small yellow flowers pushing up through the last of the snow. He stood and looked at them for a while. He didn't know the name for them. Clara had known the names of wild plants and had tried to tell him various times, and he'd listened poorly. But they were there, which was the fact that mattered. 3 small yellow things in the gap between the snow and the porch boards, making no argument for themselves, just existing. He went inside. "Come here," he said to Nora, who was at the table. "Both of you." They followed him out onto the porch. He pointed. Nora leaned over the railing and looked at the flowers with an expression of pure delight. "They're yellow," she announced. "Yes," he said. "Do they have names?" "Ask Evelyn." Evelyn was standing beside him at the railing, looking at the flowers. "Prairie buttercups, maybe," she said, "or something close to it. They come up early, before anything else." "Before the snow's even gone," Nora said, marveling at this. "That's the point of them," Evelyn said. Nora jumped down off the porch step, which Colton was about to warn her not to do because the ground was still partly frozen and uneven. But she landed fine the way she always landed fine and crouched down in front of the flowers and looked at them very closely. "They're small," she reported. "Yes," Evelyn said. "But they're here." "They're here," Evelyn agreed. Colton stood at the porch railing and looked at his daughter crouching in the mud and snow at the base of his porch steps, and at his wife beside him with her hands on the railing and the morning light in her face, and at the 3 yellow flowers in the gap between winter and whatever came next. He had a thought that wasn't a thought so much as a feeling that arrived in the shape of words. This is what surviving turns into, if you let it. Not the absence of loss, not the undoing of hard years or bad luck, or the particular cruelty of men like Greer who took what wasn't theirs and paid nothing for it. Not even the certainty that nothing would go wrong again, because things always went wrong again. That was just the nature of life out here, out anywhere. But this, 3 people on a porch in April, a ring on a woman's finger that fit now, a child in the mud talking to flowers. This was what was on the other side of the wall, if you could stop standing behind it long enough to find out. He hadn't known that. He thought he maybe hadn't been capable of knowing it 6 months ago, or a year ago, or 2 years ago, when he'd sat beside Clara in the early morning and watched her go, and then gotten up and made breakfast. Some things you couldn't know until you were in them. Some things required you to not know them first. Papa. Nora had turned around and was looking up at him with her hand shielding her eyes from the morning sun. Can we plant more? So there are more flowers? We can try, he said. Evelyn knows how. Evelyn knows how to do most things, he said. Evelyn looked at him sideways from the railing. He looked back at her. She had the edge of a smile, the one that changed her face. The same one he'd first seen on Christmas morning over the smell of cornbread, the one he hadn't seen coming then and had been glad of ever since. I don't know everything, she said. No, he agreed, but you're good at the important things. She turned back to look at Nora, who was now attempting to introduce Soot, who had appeared from somewhere, to the concept of flowers. Soot was interested, but uncertain. We should plant a garden this spring, Evelyn said. A proper one, against the south wall, where it's sheltered. Nora can help. She'll dig up everything the wrong way and ask questions about every seed. I know, Evelyn said. That's fine. He looked at the side of her face, at the line of her jaw and the way the morning light caught the loose strand of hair that had come out of the braid, at the ring on her hand on the railing. He thought about a platform in December, about one bag, about a woman who had come off a train in a coat with a mismatched button, straight-backed in the cold, measuring a stranger who was measuring her, both of them trying to see through the surface of things to whatever was underneath that might be worth building on. He'd measured wrong at first. He'd looked at what she came with and not at what she was. That was the mistake he'd almost made permanent, letting the size of a bag tell him what a person was worth. As if worth were something that showed up in luggage, as if value were something you could see from a train platform in 2 minutes flat. He knew better now. He'd always known better in the abstract. But abstract knowing and the live version of it were two different animals, and sometimes it took something specific. A woman who fixed your frozen pipe and your window frame and your daughter's loneliness without being asked, to turn the abstract into something real. That was probably the only thing worth knowing when he got down to it. Not the lesson you learned by hearing it, the lesson you learned by almost getting it wrong. Spring planting, he said. All right. Nora had now persuaded Soot to sit beside the flowers, presumably as a gesture of appreciation. Soot looked confused but cooperative. Nora explained the flowers to him in a serious voice. Evelyn watched them, and Colton watched her watching them, and the morning was cold and getting less cold, and the sky above the Wyoming flats was doing its big and different thing. And somewhere past the tree break, the cattle were making their usual complaints about the day, and the ranch sat in its last days of winter, feeling the light change, waiting for what came next. He pushed off the railing. I've got the fence line to finish on the north end, he said. I know, Evelyn said. Nora wants to help. I told you she did. I told her she could. Evelyn looked at him. You did? I said I would, he said. I'm not taking it back. He pulled his coat tighter. She's going to do it wrong twice before she does it right. That's how you learn everything, Evelyn said. He nodded and stepped off the porch. He paused at the bottom of the steps, close to where the flowers were, and looked at them for a second. Small things, yellow and stubborn in the last of the snow. Nora, he said. She looked up from her ongoing conversation with Soot. Get your coat, we're going to work fence. Nora's face went through 3 expressions in approximately 1 second. Surprise, delight, the suppression of too much delight so he didn't change his mind. She scrambled up. I'll get my gloves, she said, and ran up the porch steps past Evelyn, and the door banged behind her. Evelyn stood on the porch and looked at Colton. You're going to have to be patient, she said. I know. She's going to ask why every wire goes where it goes. I know. And why the posts are spaced that way and whether the cows notice when it's new. I know, Evelyn. She looked at him, that edge of a smile again. Go on then, she said. He turned and walked across the yard toward the barn to get the tools. The ground was thawing unevenly, soft in places and still hard in others, and he watched where he put his feet. Behind him he heard the door open again and Nora come out onto the porch, and he heard Evelyn say something to her in a low voice, and he heard Nora laugh. That full laugh, the one that went all the way down, the one that had gotten louder over winter, The one he'd forgotten was that loud and was glad to be reminded of. He kept walking. The barn ahead of him, the fence beyond that, the wide, cold morning all around. He had work to do. He always had work to do. That was the thing about a ranch. It never resolved. It never became complete. It just continued, day after day, demanding the next thing. He was grateful for it. He hadn't always been. He was now. Behind him, the porch held a woman who had come with one bag and built a household, and a girl who had held someone's hand in the dark and not let go. And between the porch steps and the south wall, 3 yellow flowers stood in the last of the snow, small and exact and undeniable, waiting for the season to catch up to what they already knew. The frontier was a hard place. It had always been a hard place. It didn't apologize for that, and it didn't soften. But it had a quality that Colton had come to understand over 8 years of working it, a quality that you had to be paying a certain kind of attention to see. It rewarded people who were still standing. Not the strongest ones, not the loudest ones, the ones who were still there, who had stayed when staying was difficult, and started over when starting over was required, and built what could be built with what they had, which was never enough, and was always somehow enough. That was what Evelyn had done. That was what he was learning to do again. The gate to the barn was frozen at the latch, and he worked it loose with his gloved hand, the way he worked everything. Not forcing it, finding where it wanted to give. It gave. He went in.